Hello and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Insaf Ki Baat. My name is Imran Khan and I am going to be your host for this episode because Komal is not in the city. So today's episode is very special because we are going to talk about an issue that concerns all Pakistanis. We have a very special expert today, Mr. Iftikhar Firdos, who is going to tell us about the militant groups operating in Pakistan, the kind of security challenges that they've posed to Pakistani state and society over the last 20 years. We all know that more than 70,000 Pakistanis have been killed over the last 20 years because of terrorism. So we are going to try to understand the militant landscape in Pakistan, how some of the militant groups such as TTP have evolved, so on and so forth, their ideology, their motivations, their modus operandi. Iftikhar, welcome to our podcast. If I may request you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your personal and professional journey and how you've ended up studying militant groups.
A lot of people actually ask me this question as to why we are interested in something that's so dangerous. And I think that an area that has been marred with terrorism, militancy, and proxy wars since almost 3 decades now, directly and probably more than that, even indirectly. I think it's a subject that's least explored within Pakistan. And one of the main reasons for that is that, people are usually scared and it's considered to be a taboo subject. And I think even as a nation, Pakistan's general repertoire of knowledge related to terrorism and militancy is pretty low. Majority of major research is on Pakistan's structural terrorism as well as, militant groups is mostly coming in from the West. So I ended up as an academic in Peshawar because I belong to the tribal areas. My father was a civil servant and I've lived mostly in Peshawar. I was born in Peshawar, but I'm from Moman tribal area. And then I studied and I went abroad and I, got a scholarship to complete my PhD. But when I was even abroad, things that, in the early 2000s, has started deteriorating back home. So when in 2006 and 7 I came back to Pakistan, where I wanted to teach. I was teaching at the University of Peshawar as well as my alma mater, which is known as Edwards College. There was one of these days, we were used to a city which basically did not even have like resurrected structures in terms of like protected walls. The city was pretty open, and it was a colonial structure, where it was pretty inclusive in terms of its space. And when I came back, what I saw was cement and barbed wire everywhere, and it perturbed me. It was disturbing to see what was happening, but I never completely grasped actually what was happening, except for the fact that many of my relatives from the tribal areas were also were being displaced. And they said that there were some new people that had been appearing in those localities, changing the customs, the rituals, as well as whatever little fabric of society remained in those areas. And so one of these days, and I remember it was somewhere between October and November, is that I was passing through one of these checkpoints. And this is the time when Musharraf had, imposed an emergency. So we saw these new structured, barbed wired sort of checkposts everywhere leading towards the cantonment. So where I taught in the institution was just across the checkpoint, and this person stopped me and he said, "You cannot actually go from use this way anymore." And I was like, "But I've been living over here, and this is the route that we've been using." And he said that we've got some sort of threat alert, and these areas are under attack. That's why we are closing down this route. And I was like, "But I'm getting late for my class." And he said, "Since you're a teacher, show me your identity and I'll let you pass." And I gave him my identity card. And I was just passing through it. But I kept on looking in the rear mirror as because it was something that was unusual for us, for a checkpoint being established right in front of my home. And I see this burqa-clad woman. She was like moving towards this checkpoint. And I was like 15 feet away from the checkpoint. And as soon as she came close, then there was this huge explosion.
Wow, she was a suicide
So
bomber.
she was one of the first female suicide bombers.
Which year
in
was
the Shah.
that?
This is in 2007. And I mean, that was something that changed everything for me because, I thought that, because I initially thought that you were academically determined, people coming out with new PhDs as well as, from universities and studying and in a lot of books in an academic circle, and you say that you'll go back and make a difference. And then I thought there was something more darker to the society which we had not understood. And that's where I decided, for 3 months being in sort of a trauma, I realized that there was something else that I wanted to do. Despite being told multiple times to go back abroad, not live over here, I decided to go for journalism. And I thought I'll give it a 6-month stint. And it's been like almost 14 years now, 13, 14 years. I never went back to academia. I just stuck to journalism. So that's a very deep background.
That's a very powerful story, and I think I cannot even begin to imagine how traumatizing it is for people who are directly affected by conflict. Like when your home city and the sort of areas that where you've grown up and you think they're safe, they are affected by terrorism, and you've witnessed that. So let's start with my first question. If you can briefly shed light on the militant landscape in Pakistan, what kind of militant organizations operate in the country, their typologies, some of the commonalities and differences, and we'll just later focus on TTP because I think we should just cover one today, and perhaps later we can talk about others. But
so, Imran, in terms of Pakistan's landscape related to terror outfits, there's a history attached to this area. If you look at the chronological development on how the militant landscape has changed, you see 3 distinct time frames. One is between 1978 and 1984. And then that continues, and then you see a transformation between 1994 and then 2001. And then from 2001 till 2018, there's a very different structure. And then 2018 till the current times that we are in is a very different structure. So all of these have, distinct features, distinct militant groups. Initially, one can suppose to say, and that is an hypothesis, that, terrorism in Pakistan begins in the form of sectarianism. And this is the time, because for a discourse analysis on terrorism, you have to put in the guard somewhere to sort of measure the mile from where we're actually beginning the discourse. So I think it's the sectarianism in Pakistan is a direct defensive correlation to the revolution in Iran. And we see,
1979, right?
1979 till 1984. And the rest of it is just, later on an extension of it when, the Americans, they come in and they, along with the Pakistani state authorities, are resurrecting the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And so this particular time frame is interesting because literally whatever's happening even now is directly related to what was happening between 1978 and 1984. These are the fermenting years. You've got the Iranian Revolution, you've got Maududi's, ideological spectrum gaining pace right till the Middle East. You also see, different militant organizations from Egypt and northern parts of Africa rising. And Afghanistan becomes the cauldron where everybody wants to get rid of, their part of the burden that they carry in terms of what they think are extremely radical individuals. And so it becomes a dumping yard where everybody tries to put their people. It's interesting because when in retrospect, when you look at these organizations, A lot of people believe that they were considered to be taboo or subjects even back then, but it wasn't that way because if you start reconstructing history, Al Qaeda uh, held its first press conference in Peshawar, and it was an open press conference. I mean, people were allowed, journalists were allowed. It was not considered to be the threat which it became later on in the 90s, and then ultimately that led to 9/11. In the same capacity, if you look at what we now consider to be the major Taliban threat, was something that has its, initialization in the Russian war. So history changes, but what is left back in terms of, if you look at it very academically, and I'm speaking very strictly academically, is that the needs for nation states change while the individuals that they use for their agendas somehow remain unchanged and they remain wrapped up in time. So probably the world moved on, but they left back a lot of people along with themselves, which they remain unchanged, and forgot about them, and it morphed into something very different, and it went into different directions. Um,
Right. So, if Takhar, if I can just interject here, I understand that in, for example, in 1990s, there were so many India-focused militant groups that were operating in Pakistan. But after the ceasefire of 2001, when Musharraf came into power, some of those India-focused militant groups gradually they were dismantled or decommissioned, whatever term you want to use. So I mean, there were plethora of militant groups operating in Pakistan in 1990s. But let's focus on some that are currently operating in the country that are very effective, that pose threat to the country. And the historical context that you gave, that was super useful, because I think there are two important events that you highlighted. One was the Iranian Revolution that leads to a sort of sectarian reaction in Pakistan. The other was, of course, the war in Afghanistan. Those were the two very, very important events that you mentioned. But let's come to today's Pakistan, the contemporary challenge. What does that look like in terms of the militant landscape?
So we see in terms of contemporary Pakistan, I think the TTP emerges to be one of the biggest threats for Pakistan, at least. What is the TTP is interesting because it's not the TTP that was formed somewhere in 2007. I remember the first time from the area that I come from, it was the 31st of July 2007. And there was this, British war revolutionized sort of a hero that was locally celebrated, and he's known as Haji Saab Torangzai, and he has his shrine over there. And it is immediately in reaction to the Lal Masjid operation that we see almost, 15 to 20,000 individuals coming up and calling themselves the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So the first announcement comes from Oman. And then later on, different chapters re-emerge in Waziristan and other areas of the tribal belt. This was not a random occurrence. If you read militant texts, particularly Al-Qaeda, one of the main ideologues that you see is Abdullah Azam. So Abdullah Azam is this very interesting character who's basically, from the Middle East, and he studied at Al-Azhar. And then he becomes Osama's teacher. But he comes, and stays in Peshawar.
And he was killed in Peshawar.
He was killed in Peshawar in a bombing. His grave is in the Jalozai area in Nowshera. Still, we had at some point one of the largest Afghan refugee camps. But if you read the texts, Abdullah Azam is strategizing, and that's why they called it the Al-Qaeda, which is basically the base for everything else. And so you read his text somewhere between 85 and 88, and he's actually saying that you cannot fight in the Middle East because it's a desert, and so you don't have any place to hide, and you cannot fight in anywhere else in relation to the plains of Central Asia, because those are governed more by Russia, as well as the state rules are pretty much hard and fast. So there's one place between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is the Pakistan's tribal area. And so these are people who are independent, they're fierce, and they will not take any rule of law.
Wow, this is super interesting. If you can just pause here, I mean, it's not just an accident that a lot of these militant groups end up there. There is a methodology behind that. There were a lot of deliberations, and it was very very deliberate, right?
Obviously, I mean, if you look at it textually as well as historically, there was a consolidated effort to actually make it rise from this place. And so Azam's texts are some of those relevant materials which for any researchers are important because it gives you an idea on what Al-Qaeda was trying to do. So in the formative years of the TTP, if you look at the organization, it seems to be a sort of a trope for Al-Qaeda to engage the Pakistani state as well as the Americans as well as anyone else that was interfering into the region in accordance to their agenda. And then when you look at the TTP, the way that it evolved, and none of the leadership of the TTP has been killed in a military operation. All of them have been killed in drone strikes. And then there's infighting that you see within the group as well. And I think 2014, as I said, was important because in 2014 you see Hakimullah Masood, who basically in the TTP was an organization which still is an organization that is owned by the Masood tribe. There won't be enough time to describe on why the Masoods became radical, why were they always considered to be outcasts, because it hasn't only been, post-independence. It's always been there even at the time of the British Raj, that they were always annexed from the territory and considered to be a tribe that was non-obedient as well as outcasts. And one of the reasons to punish them was that they were not given a main road right up till very recently. They had to cross into the Wazir tribe from South Waziristan, to cross over into mainstream Pakistan as well as into Afghanistan. They had their own birthday. And that's why they never got their own border crossing as well. So the border crossing for South Waziristan is in Angurada. It's in the Wazir territory. It's not in the Masood area. So they were always considered to be the non-cooperative tribe, the recalcitrant voice, as you might call it. And that continued. And so when the TTP sort of, was an entity that came into being, the Masoods were the one that were leading it from the forefront. And as you directly said...
And some Masoods, you would not want to associate the entire tribe with that.
Exactly, some Masoods. Obviously, as we say that, not everybody is a terrorist, but I'm just explaining the Masood territory in terms of its geography, because that has a lot of associations with it. Why did this entire thing start was that when the tribal areas that held its own identity, for the first time you see post-2001, the Pakistan military entering into the tribal areas. Before that, they were under an agreement with, Quaid-e-Azam, who promised them that their own identity as well as their own way of life would be kept intact. And I'll come back to this right at the end as well, because this is an important point. But when the military starts entering, obviously there are operational excesses everywhere. And when you're under international pressure, and I'm sure, Imran, you remember the years after 9/11, how depressive they were and what was happening. There would be bombings every day. There were protests every day. I remember my college being closed down for almost 6 months in Peshawar because it was ransacked. It was a missionary institution. And so, these groups, which initially focused on India, and they had linkages with Afghanistan as well. Its history is there. They were nurtured by the state. So when you make a paradigmatic shift in 2001 to say that no more of this,
there was bound to be a reaction from the groups and the ideologues that you had been supporting.
Supporting not even alone, supporting along with all other countries, including the United States, And it's written history, we can't change it. It's obviously the writing on the wall. How well Pakistan tackled it is a question that can be argued, but its history is pretty clear on that.
So, again, you've kind of explained that, but if I can very explicitly and ask you, what's the role of ideology? What's the role of political, economic development conditions in the genesis of TTP? You've explained already geopolitics a little bit, regional situation, and so on. But do you think that ideology is really at the core of TTP and particular socio-economic conditions in the newly merged districts?
I think Zam's text and one of the two lines that I actually told you is something that is reflective of that, is because they are underdeveloped areas. And the FCR was not repealed till almost 2017. We had 114 years of FCR rule with no development. Even currently, the conflict is in areas which are underdeveloped. So it's not that development can be totally forsaken, or kept out of this entire spectrum by saying that no, it's not responsible for it. Obviously, in an area where you have no schools, where you have no hospitals, even currently they're almost in government documents 48% dormant health facilities in Waziristan, and in reality almost 90% of them are non-functional. Nobody wants to go and work there, not just because of the situation, but because of the lack of facilities as well. So it's a natural consequence of something that you leave behind and you don't bring it back in time along with yourself. As I told you earlier, there is obviously something that's going to sort of metamorphosize in there, which will be alien to the rest of your country because you've just left it out, you've ostracized these communities. And that's something that subsequent governments in Pakistan have not realized. But Imran, I think that, saying that, it's very important to say that the ideology, this particular ideology that we talk about, which is violent and extremist, that does exist. And I think that the economic and political markers are there, but obviously the ideology has survived through times, and it is still something that's growing.
And it is a global ideology. You've got ISIS that operated from Iraq to Syria to Afghanistan, Pakistan, right?
A lot of people actually, when they talk of IS, and that's why I said 2014, because IS in Pakistan, which is ISKP in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Islamic State Khorasan, is an offshoot of the TTP. Because in 2014, when a Masood leader is killed in a drone strike, which is Hakimullah Masood, you have this guy from Swat who is comparatively lesser known, but he has survived a military operation. So his name is Fazlullah. And he is sort of ranked, he outranks all of them. And then there are other people from the tribal areas to say that we have larger contributions to this group. And so they sort of, go against him. And that's where they join hands with IS Central. And you see ISKB in the formation coming in mostly from the Orakzai part of the tribal districts and some, defined elements of the Afghan Taliban. But just going into the history of IS, and this is also very interesting because in 2014, and I remember exactly, it was August 2014, I received this pamphlet on my email which says that since Zarqawi was in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, basically they refer to Peshawar, so the caliphate will be established over here. It will start from here. And it didn't make any sense to me. It was a pamphlet that was sent in 4 different languages. So I went and sort of started researching on who Zarqawi was, because our understanding of terrorism and militancy, at least mine, was more locally oriented. So I did not understand back in 2013 and 14 on what the connections to the international global jihadist networks was. And I realized that basically Zarqawi as a child was based in Peshawar, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. But by the time he reached Afghanistan, the Soviets had withdrawn. So his need for jihad was unquenched, and he went back to Jordan. But when he went back to Jordan, he was jailed. And it was only after the death of King Hussein I, when his son actually took over, so he was facing resistance from the religious class. And as by order of a decree, he actually asked to release all those people who were in jails that belonged to that had some sort of religious affiliation. To my astonishment, when Zarqawi was released from jail, the first thing that he did was he actually got a ticket to Peshawar. And he came to Peshawar as a honey trader along with his mother. And that's where he, bought all those elements who were along with him in 1989. And from there, he went and traveled and met Osama. They kept him for a month to see that whether he was not a spy. And he was given to Saif al-Adl at that time. And so they said that even Al-Qaeda thought that his ideology was too brutal for them. So they invested in him by giving him a camp in Helmand. And so the first thing after 2001 that was hit was Osama's compound, and then the other one was Zarqawi's compound in Helmand. But what basically happened was that's where Zarqawi escaped from and went through Iran to Iraq. And that's where he formed IS.
So, Iftikhar, these stories and anecdotes about leaders of militant organizations that you're telling us, they're fascinating. And this brings me to the question, what role do charismatic leaders within these militant organizations play? It seems like some of them are entirely driven by one person or two leaders who could be great strategists in that context, who could be great ideologues. I don't know if, where would you put Osama bin Laden and some of these like TTP leaders, Hakimullah Masood, Baitullah Masood, the current leaders. So how much of, these militant organizations, especially TTP, driven by one person, or do they have like second tier leadership, third tier leadership? How do they really operate? Do they operate like a structured institutional, or they are just a sort of loose network of different interests, maybe some criminals who are motivated by this sense of adventure and their financial gains? Tell us a little bit about that.
So initially, I also thought, like many others, that it was loosely structured and certain people under a certain ideology had come together without any strategy. But now when I can say that I have a little bit of knowledge at least about these militant groups, it's pretty well structured. Obviously, leaders, as you mentioned, some of these leaders of these jihadist organizations, their charisma as well as their strategy reigns in people. And I'll come back to that even further in the discussion as to how this entire thing works. But since you mentioned structure, if you make a comparison between the TTP in 2007 and TTP of 2018, it's very, very different. In 2007, we see a loosely formed conglomerate whose agenda is very, it's just a single point that Pakistan is an ally of the US. And so that's why Pakistan is under target from us. That's a single point agenda. But in 2018, it's very different. The Americans are no longer here. In 2023, the Americans are no longer here. So what's the war about? And I remember in 2021, in February, we see the TTP coming up with a structure, which is somewhat similar to what the Afghan Taliban had in 2008. And it's a structure saying that this is how we will operate now. But then in December of 2022, we see this full-fledged structure, which is almost like a proxy or a parallel government, and as you said, leaderships, but Afghanistan becomes, that's one song for everyone to sort of, imitate. In the way as
success story, right? It's their success story.
So they say that we defeated the British, we defeated the Russians, and now we've defeated the Americans. So that is, the original archetype that needs to be followed. And so we see the TTP now simulating the similar structure. in that way. But then there are groups like the Islamic State, because we see the TTP and the Afghan Taliban, having as to not attract a lot of international attention. The ideology as well as the scope of the work, as if you might call it, is more localized. But then there are groups like the Islamic State. And when you look at their structure, it's actually trying to portray a structure of a state where they would have 18 different ministries almost anywhere that they find a place. So it's pretty well structured to say that it is something that is without a structure, and to create a corpus of literature, because every group requires, in order to attract somebody, in order for new recruits, you require history. So there is this huge chunk of propaganda that's been published from all militant organizations who try to interpret history the way that they want to. And so that becomes their history. So anybody who's looking to sort of join the group and see that it's not something new, because newness in terms of that particular, mindset says that they're working on someone's agenda. So then to create that, that lure to say that it is something that has existed throughout history, it's not something new.
So now that you've unpacked for us the structure of TTP, its modus operandi, tell us how much of a threat TTP poses to Pakistani state today. Do they pose an existential threat to the Pakistani state? I mean, it seems they are a big issue to deal with for the Pakistani states. That's why the current government is making an argument that we need to postpone the elections because of security situation. And as we speak, the military leadership is giving an in-camera briefing in the National Assembly about the planned military operation against TTP. So first question is that what kind of threat they pose to Pakistani society today? And we know that the past couple of months have been extremely deadly for Pakistan due to TTP perpetrated violence. But also tell us, about the successes of Pakistani states, such as the success of Zarbia's operation. Why was that successful in dislodging TTP from some of its safe havens, and can that success be recreated today, this year? And we know that right now we don't have the support of the international community. We don't have the aid that was coming back time. So keeping all of that in mind, your analysis.
Imran, I think it's very important, because I often keep on hearing the analysis because we've suffered through one phase of terrorism, which is between 2007 to 2014. And then there is a relative calm, and then once again, it starts again. So I often see these comparisons and keep on hearing about these comparisons. But it's very important, I think, to unpack this comparison. So you have military rule in Pakistan. It's more the Musharraf era, and there's a one-window operation. Pakistan becomes the global ally, in the war against terrorism. So it's a coalition partner. Literally all rules and regulations are made by an executive order. So there's hardly any consensual opinion that's required. There's a parliament in there later on, but it's not considered to be a parliament that went down in history as a parliament, obviously. And then the cash inflow is pretty high. And the agenda is clear, is to get rid of the Taliban government in Afghanistan and establish democratic rule as well as peace in the region. Move into the current times, the American withdrawal. They're literally undoing almost everything that was done almost 2 decades ago. So the Taliban are back. They're more palatable now. The cash outflow is immense. The entire region, as well as there's a global economic crunch, and Pakistan is caught in the midst of it as well. And then lastly, there is political turmoil in the country. It's not a military dictatorship. Under these circumstances, I think these two situations are almost uncomparable. I think the situation now is more tense and requires more deliberation than what we had in 2001. The success stories came from a process of learning from that experience. There was enough.
It took us almost 13
Yeah.
years, right? From 2001 to
I mean,
2014.
till 2012, Pakistan did not even have a counter narrative to terrorism. There were people still in doubt. A lot of what there was more to believe by the people from the militants than they actually believed in the state. And then in post APS, you have this narrative that's building up. And that's your national narrative, what we call the National Action Plan. But to say that it will be relaunched again under these circumstances requires the same, requires everybody to be on the same page. And the same page is an often used cliche in Pakistan, where they say they might be on the same page but on different books. So I think that the situation now is very tense, and whatever is happening in this country requires consensus. So you have Imran Khan, in whose government we initiated the peace talks. And you've got the statement from the National Security Commission as well, which doesn't only blame Afghanistan, Imran Khan, sorry. The statement from the National Security Commission says that this entire regime was to blame, which includes the security apparatus for empowering the TTP once again.
Wow. So basically, the current divisions within Pakistan's polity, the polarization, the lack of unity makes us particularly more vulnerable to TTP, and it emboldens them in some ways. Is that what you're saying? It gives them more space, and they are smart. They realize that, don't they?
See, Imran, I believe that there are two things basically, which all jihadist organizations agree on in this region. Number one is that they don't believe in the Durand Line. They think it's all the same country. And the second thing is that they don't believe in democracy. If the democratic system fails in Pakistan, and whatever's happening right now, obviously, even if you have even any basic understanding on how democracies function, that's not how democracies function. If the youth in this country lose hope in democracy, I think that we're in a very big trouble.
This brings me to a question about the politics in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and newly merged districts. What's the role of political parties and other, democratic political actors over there? Can they not regain that ideological space from militant organizations? Given that we've been in this war and terror, whatever you call it, for the last 20 years, and by the way, from 2014 to 2016, 17, and until 2021, there was that space where the violence had reduced. So political actors had some space, KP government had some space. Of course, federal government and the security institutions also, they also share that, sort of responsibility. What did political forces in KP do?
That's an interesting question. And although I avoid giving any sort of political answers, but one thing is for sure that in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf enjoys quite a bit of popularity, including the tribal areas. I also keep on seeing most of these tweets as well as stories coming in saying that people are protesting, that the terrorists are back or the militants are back. And they say that it's a public outcry. But what they actually forget to unpack is that what the people are saying is that the state and the militants can fight amongst themselves. We are not going to support any of them. So it's not like it's the support for one is bringing out people against the other. That's not the case as well. And I think initially if we saw such protests or people coming together, that was for the state against militants. So that should answer your question in terms of, why they cannot regain territory, because the general sentiment across the tribal areas is that it was the security establishment which brought back these people that were once flushed out from this locality. And so they are the ones that are responsible for it. We are not responsible. And then secondly is the PTI, voter base in these areas thinks that they have been unnecessarily, uh, I would say, put against the wall for things that they were not responsible for. And so it's not through a democratic process. So the structure from the local government side, if you're speaking, it's mostly PTI that's being elected. Whereas the governance structure now is, although there's no government per se, but whatever the interim government is doing and whatever is the federal government is doing is considered to be antagonistic in these areas. And when you talk about consensus, we've seen Ali Wazir and Mohsin Dawud speak openly that there should be no military operation in these localities anymore, So I don't think there's a national consensus on large-scale military operations. And I personally think that it's not possible because the money is not there also for such large-scale military operations any longer.
And they can be very counterproductive because they add to the grievances of the local populations, and with this displacement, it takes a long time for the affected populations to come out of the trauma of the new violence that they witness. How do you think the Afghan Taliban are helping TTP in current situation? Is it active support? Are they putting the foot down on TTP in terms of the TTP commanders or, rank and file that is still in Afghanistan? How does that variable play out in TTP's calculus of operations in Pakistan?
So just to be very clear, the TTP was never separate from the Afghan Taliban. Only at some point during Hakimullah Masood, because he was considered to be more radical than others, he did oppose the Afghan Taliban in one way or another because of his but he had closer ties to Al-Qaeda than the Afghan Taliban at that time. But all of that is history now. I think there's no difference between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. The Taliban are almost all the same.
Okay, next question.
Just a small little explanation. Because in militant organizations, the hierarchy of decision making is based on baya, which is swearing allegiance to someone or owing allegiance to someone. So if you look at the spiritual hierarchy, Habatullah is in the center, whereas TTP, Al-Qaeda, and all the Afghan Taliban factions almost are under his direct command. So and under this spiritual, hierarchy, one group cannot act against the other because they are directly under the supervision of one leader. So it will not make any sense. Rather, it would consider to be, somebody who's breaking their oath to their leader if they actually attack each other. So they will not move or do anything. There was some effort initially to restrain them, but that has backfired.
So they are essentially, TTP is a local franchise of Afghan Taliban.
It's the veritable arm of the Afghan Taliban in the tribal areas, in the Pashtun belt.
Right. So I suppose you also deal with the people from the security institutions who are engaged in counterterrorism. And you earlier in your comments, you mentioned that, militant groups are still understudied in Pakistan. In terms of the understanding of their motives and their strengths, do you think that, in our security institutions, there is a fairly nuanced understanding of their strengths? And do you think that based on that intelligence, that knowledge, our institutions have a strategy? They could sort of, tackle this challenge this time around as well?
See, militant groups are, they are very intelligent. They're always ahead of the state, 2 steps ahead of the state. But not to say that the Pakistani, security forces as well as intelligence agencies, have not been able to tackle it. And we're a witness of all of that. I mean, the success of Zarb-e-Azam.
Yeah, and they've given those sacrifices and they've dealt with the challenge.
What's important is that the previous experience, because Pakistan, its police as well as, counterterrorism wings were something that were new. And they have enough experience under their belt to actually tackle such things. but the jihadist sphere is evolving on daily basis. I think it's more of more than the tactical and kinetic part of it. It's more on the ideological basis. So Pakistan might have a conducive and a well-formed counter-terrorism policy, but it doesn't have a counter-extremism policy. So if it was based on the fact that he could get rid and kill all the militants and all of this would end, I think the figures that the Pakistani state or the international community has been given in Afghanistan and Pakistan, by now militancy should have ended. But the fact that they are reproducing more and more, and the TTP is gaining more strength, and even other militant organizations are gaining more strength, is that we do not have a counter-extremism policy. And obviously there are several other reasons which are beyond the military's domain. I think more needs to be done in terms to counter ideologies rather than just focus on the counterterrorism part.
I think that's a very, very important point. And again, TTP is a symptom in that sense. The ideology that underpins TTP's genesis and rise and success to some extent is religious extremism. And, over the years, we've witnessed violence perpetrated by that ideology on our university campuses across the country. So that violence will not go away until we address the problem of religious extremism. But my question to you is, if you were a policymaker, you've studied this issue for decades now, what would you recommend? What's the long-term solution to counter religious extremism in Pakistan? Is it substantive democracy? Is it making Pakistani state institution society more inclusive? Or what's the solution? What's the silver bullet here?
I think one of the, and I'll take a sort of a key from your, what you call this podcast is
Insaf Ki Baat.
I think justice is one of the main pillars. When you summarize all of it, the lack of justice is actually something that originates all of this. So if we can actually have a justice system that delivers in time as well as equally, I think majority of these problems can be resolved. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Iftikhar, for joining us today and for sharing your insights about militant groups, about their ideology, how they operate, what's their organizational structure, and also what kind of response it should, generate from Pakistani state and society. I think for me, there are a lot of takeaways in today's podcast, but, there are two that I want to share with you. One is that perhaps another military operation in the newly merged districts might not be the solution because, ordinary people of the newly merged districts might also suffer. The other is that, Pakistani state and society have to come up with a strategy to deal with the problem of religious extremism that underpins, organizations like TTP. I'm glad that Iftikhar could join us today and share his insights with you. Thank you so much.